Welcome! This is the last part to a 3-part tutorial series where I go through my method for designing and animating some esports graphics inside of After Effects. We've gone through the designing and animation process, but today we're getting a bit more technical and creating a template that is flexible and can adapt to different player profiles. We're taking advantage of the essential graphics and a truckload of expressions that help us change the size of text based on how many characters there are, a color tinting system that automatically generates beautiful color palettes, as well as easy to exchange assets. So let's get into it. So this is where we left off at the end of part 2, and I just want to make some tweaks so it can be prepared for a player profile. I'm going to get rid of the faceless void character in the background here. I'm going to also hide the welcome to the text that we have at the top here, hide that for a moment, and I want to adapt this Melbourne Major text here to be a player name. And I'm going to pick the name Tiger at the moment because I think it's a good length of a name, 5 letters, and I'm just going to right align that for a moment and bring that over to the right. I may even make this a little bit bigger, maybe 420 pixels for now, but we're going to be automatically resizing this in the future anyway. So I may just scale it up for a moment. Just get the idea of a layout for now. I've also prepared some player assets here, team logos, player photos, and all of that. I'm going to be utilizing a couple of that. So I'm going to bring in the player photo here, but I'm just going to put it above the toner for a moment. I don't want it to be completely swamped by the color scheme at the moment. So I'm just going to scale them up a little bit to get to the right kind of ratio here and drop them off to the side. Just fine tune that a little bit. I like the idea of him overlapping the name in the background. I'm going to also parent this layer to the foreground null, the foreground movement null that we've got going on here, as well as moving this light spot from where it used to be behind the hero character that we had before. We can now position it behind the player profile. And it's just going to make them pop a little bit more. I'll also change the parenting of this light spot from the original background null, pointing it towards the player photo, just so that they stay in sync the entire time. The first thing that I want to address in this project is the idea of automatic resizing text, because in sports and esports, players' names can have varying lengths. It can be just one letter or it can be multiple words. And we want text to automatically resize rather than us having to constantly change the text size to suit. And there's a nice system that we have here, and it involves adjusting the layer's scale. And we can add an expression to that layer and then specify a max width and max height that the text can be. I'm going to just write 2 variables in here, max width, and set that to around about 1,000 pixels, adding in with a semicolon, going down one line, and going max height being around about 600. To be able to figure out how large this text layer should be scaled up, we first have to grab the layer's current size. I'm just going to grab another value here for rect, and I go source rect at time, which is going to grab the bounding box of this text layer. We also get to specify a specific time. And since this text actually animates at the start, it has this whole text animator and it changes its bounding box. If we specify 5 here, 5 seconds into the piece, we know that the text is rested, it's not doing anything complicated, and it's an accurate representation of its size. Now that we've got this rect variable, so we can now grab some important information like the starting width. We can just go starting width as a new variable, rect, and then width. Ending in that with a little semicolon again, going down to starting height. There's a new variable, rect, height. Next up is the complicated part. We go down another 2 lines and we're going to be declaring a new variable called scale change. Add an equal sign after that, and now we're pretty much going to be running an if statement, which is going to be comparing its current width and current height, comparing it to the max height and max width, and finding out which one it has more room to grow until it reaches those bounding boxes. We first start off by comparing the starting width and dividing that by the starting height, using the greater than symbol and comparing that to the max width divided by the max height. Based on whether we're scaling up by the width or the height to reach the max values, we then get to calculate the value in which it is required to reach that max value. We start off with a question mark first. If we're scaling up by the width, we go max width divided by the starting width. However, if we're going to be scaling up by the height, we need to add in that kind of instance where we can say a colon here to say that if it's going to be the reverse and we're going to be going by the height, we want to go max height divided by the starting height. Now we've got that bit of mess out of the way, we can now hit a semicolon, go down a couple of lines and type in value times scale change. If we click out now, you'll see that our text has scaled up very nicely. If we just reset the scale now to 100%, you'll see that the Tiger name is automatically resized to its max width. But now if we change this name to something, say, a bit shorter, like the player BZM, you'll see that it's maintained that width and has automatically scaled up the text to fit it. Now it's at 185%. If we go something even a bit shorter, like the player called FY, you'll see that it's already not reaching out any further to the left. It's not trying to overscale because it's already reached its max height of 600. We can always dive back into this and fine tune that the max height could be 800, and it's automatically going to scale up to fit that. But if a name comes out that reaches that max width, it's going to automatically scale it down to suit that bounding box. There are many occasions where there's a player's names that would go across 2 lines that exceed to the amount of space that we have. If we have the player's name called Nothing to Say, for instance, you'll notice that it's a little bit squishy at that point. It would be good to be able to add in a return line like we could here, and it automatically resized. But you get the issue here that it's automatically just put it below and everything is no longer center aligned. And I wanted an expression that would also help automate that. That involves adding an expression to the anchor point property. So I'm going to hit A on my keyboard to bring up that property. I'll click on it to bring up the expressions and backspace it for now. Much like the last expression, we should get the current layer's bounding box by typing in rect again and go source rec at time. And once again, just stipulating the 5 seconds into it where everything is nice and settled. And with that, we can then add in a semicolon. And the way that the source rect at time works is that we get access to a bunch of different variables that are really handy to work with. We've already worked with width and height so far, but it also returns things like the top and left position point of the layer. And we can utilize that to be able to isolate the very middle right point of this layer and put the anchor point there, which would then align it back in the center for us. So the first value that we're going to be stipulating here is the X value, typing in equals, followed by a rec with the left value here. And we can also then plus rect dot width, which is automatically going to move this position point over to the very far right hand side. And we can finish that off with a semicolon. Next is Y. We can hit Y equals rect dot top plus in the rect dot height. But since we only want to be halfway down the height of this thing, we can type in divided by 2 and end that with a semicolon. Enter a couple of times. We can then write X and Y to return that to the anchor point. That automatically is going to isolate that middle right-hand point of this layer. And because we're moving the anchor point and not the position of the layer, it's going to reorientate itself to always be in the center. So once again, if we backspace this, type in the word tiger, it's going to keep it in the middle. But if we want to change that to something else like the hilarious person's name, Toronto, Tokyo, it's also going to realign itself based upon its own scaling and its own position bounding box. Pretty handy. One of the things that I found is that the height restriction on double-lined text is sometimes a little bit too restrictive. With names such as BZM, they take up a bunch of space and they look really nice in the process. Or someone like the name FY. FY is getting a little bit too large for my liking here. So I'm just going to go back to the max height and bring this back down to, say, 600 or so. And that's just going to help restrict that a little bit. Maybe 700. Find a nice middle ground. Very good. But if you have a name that is going to be 2 lines but aren't very long overall, like if we type in the words FY, you'll find that it's a bit more restrictive. Like it doesn't need to be that restrained when it comes to the height since it's already quite short. So what we can also stipulate here is that with an extra if statement in the scale expression, we can say, hey, if there's any enter lines, any return lines in this source text here, we can just increase the max height by a little bit. We can type in if followed by a bracket here, text, just to access the text itself, source text dot include, so we can just see if anything is included in the process. And in quotation marks, do a backslash, which is the one that's above your enter key most likely, followed by R. Moving to the very end of the line, we can open up some curly brackets here and just say that the max height should be instead, let's say 850. And that with its own curly bracket. So this extra line now means that if it does detect that there's a return line at all, it will just increase the max height by that little bit. And you can see that now our text is made itself a little bit larger because it's got the room for it. But if we bring this back to 1 line, it's going to restrict itself. You can even see if we include an extra line that automatically rescales, but we don't need to have that right now. I'm going to bring back the name to Tiger as I'm pretty happy with the whole system. I'm going to check on the player photo here to see how that is positioned currently, because I think the scaling of this player photo is not going to work out too well. If you just click back a couple of times, you'll see that it never really enters very nicely. So I'm just going to animate the position property here of the original player photo and probably line it up with the original scale foreground movement null that we have here. Since it's parented to it. In that first keyframe, I'm just going to push it off to the left-hand side, just so it's out of sight, out of mind. Much better. I can then apply the easing that we've been doing for the entire animation so far. But you'll see that if I go back to the value graph, you have to deal with both the X and the Y, which is a bit of a shame. So I'm just going to right click on the position property and go separate dimensions, which is something you can enable by default if you so desire. I don't use that enough though. And I can just remove these Y position keyframes since nothing actually happens there. But now that we've just isolated the X value and we're only dealing with one particular value, we can go back into the graph editor and animate to our heart's content here, just using the same kind of drawing that we've been doing for all the other ones so far. Let's preview that back. Looking pretty decent, but that light spot is doing a lot of stuff that I'm not interested in at the moment. The movement looks good though, so I'm going to just go back to this initial kind of keyframe, scroll on down to find the original light spot here on my keyboard to find the timing. I'm going to bring this keyframe forward a little bit, and I may actually reverse this movement and go from like -5 instead, so that over the course of a couple of seconds that it actually brightens up and kind of highlights our main player a little bit more nicely. For a little bit of visual interest, I also wanted to bring in some particular heroes that these players are known for and set up a system so that I can just drop in different heroes based upon the player that's currently being featured. So I've just imported 2 different heroes here that are going to represent our 2 players that we've currently got imported. And I'm going to drag in this Dark Willow character to be behind the main text here, but not being blurred out just yet. So just above this slow atmosphere. You see that they've been brought in. It looks pretty good so far. Position over just the back of the text, I think, so that it's, still around, but not drawing too much attention to itself. I'll bring down the scale to around about 60 or so, just so that they're able to be a bit more visible, but again, not taking up too much real estate. I'm going to parent this layer to the midground null, so it's kind of moving in sync with the main player name. And then I'm also going to animate its position based upon the midground null and the player photo so far, just lining up with those current keyframes here and just letting it slide in that little bit over the course of a couple of seconds. Once again, doing the same kind of treatment, separating the dimensions, getting rid of the Y position and animating the X position so it slides in that little bit quicker. It's looking pretty decent though. I do want to, I think, retime this light spot second keyframe that a little bit, bring it in a bit sooner so it doesn't take so long to liven up the scene. But that hero there looks really good. One of the things I wanted to also implement here is the idea of being able to manipulate this position just that little bit. If you were to bring in a different character and it was framed a little bit differently, being able to easily adjust the position of the Y and the X value without having to dive in and start manipulating all these keyframes. What we can do is bring in the effect called a point control, which is an expression controller, which doesn't do anything out of the box, but it does allow us to be able to stipulate an X and Y value. I'm just going to zero these out for the moment, just to help us there. And I'm going to add an expression to the X value, just taking in its original value, transform.x position, which looks great, adding in a plus sign, and just using this little pick whip to point towards that first value of the point. Not the name itself, but just this first value. That means that every time we adjust this very value here, it's going to move the position of our character while keeping the animation the same as it was prior. We can also do that for the Y value, so we get to enable that. Clicking on the stopwatch, transform.y position, plus, and pick whipping that second value, so that when we change the second value, we also get to be able to move it up and down. That's handy to be able to fine tune it once we start involving essential graphics, but for now we can just keep that zeroed. Now, right now, our character doesn't really blend in with the scene at all. It's right above the toner, so it's not taking on any of the colors. So what I was wanting to do is bring in the CC toner effect and apply it, but with a more increased blending with original, because you can see if we bring this below, it's completely blown out and doesn't look good at all. So what I can recommend is copying the CC toner effect and pasting it onto the player profile. Now, you could do the whole copy with property links and all of that, which would be great, but one of the annoying things about when you do that is that it also takes into account the composition name, and it's just a bit more convoluted and kind of breaks things in the process. So I'm just going to do it myself manually here. Opening up the CC toner effect and looking up at the toner effect as well, just so we can see them both in our little timeline. I may just move some things around in the meantime. What we're going to do here is just pick whip the highlights from the player profile, just to be looking at the CC toner equivalent properties inside of the original toner level. But what we can do here is instead is just amp up the blend with original to about 80 or so, and we get a nice little blend between what was originally there, and we get like little hints of the original color scheme without it being too dominant. With that, I was also wanting to introduce the team logo to the background as a nice little just visual point. I have one at the moment. I'm just going to drag that in and putting it underneath the background blur currently. I'm just going to position that over to the right a little bit more so it's away from my player photo. Maybe scale it down just a smidge. But the main thing here is going to be changing its blending mode from normal to screen, just so it kind of absorbs the background a little bit more, and also reducing its opacity to around about like 40%. Yeah, it's looking pretty decent, maybe 50%. Just so it's visually there, but nothing too crazy in the process. To tie this together, I'm then going to parent this layer to the background movement null so that it does that original scale of that we had keyframed in the last part. I also wanted to include some little details about these players, and I'm going to bring back the welcome to the text that we have here. I'm going to right align it for the meantime and bring it down underneath our main character. We're going to automate this a little bit more in a few moments, but right now I'm just going to change the text to reflect this player and open this up to Essential Graphics in the future. I'm just going to reduce the text size to around about 32, just so we get a bit more space, and maybe even move across our main character a little bit so that they don't take up so much space. So utilizing that last keyframe just to push them across. Handy that the light spot moves with them. That's looking pretty good so far. I wanted to set up a system here so that whenever this main player name changes size, which it will, bigger names, shorter names, double lines and all of that, I wanted this player detail text to always be just that little bit below it automatically without us having to do anything. Now we currently already have that system set up in place to a degree, since it's currently parented to the main player name. Whenever we change the scale of this current layer based upon the length of the name, it automatically pushes itself down by the same amount, but it also scales it, and that was something I was wanting to avoid. And I'm sure there's many different ways you could go about solving this, but this is just the way that I found it was the most flexible. What involves first is changing the parent of the detail text to be matching that of the original player name, which is going to be the midground null. So I'm just going to go in there and change that. Next up is adding an expression to the player detail text position property. I'll clicking on that and backspacing that to begin with. I'm going to add in a square bracket just to open it all up, since we're dealing with an array. And for the X value, the very first value is going to be identical to that of the player name. So I'm just going to use the little pick whip down here just to bring it down to the player name, the position, and the X value of that layer. It's a good start. Now it gets a bit more complicated. I'm going to add in a comma to now start dealing with the Y value. And the idea here is that we want to find the Y value of this layer, which is going to be the middle point, since we've done the anchor point expression. We're going to find half of its height to get us down to the very bottom right of it, and adding a little bit of padding involved so that our text has a little bit of room to breathe. So the first value that we have to deal with is the Y position of the player name text. Pointing it down towards the position of that layer again and looking at the Y value, it's a good start. Adding in a plus sign, and now we have to get the source rect at time at the 5 point, taking its height and dividing it by 2 to be able to get to that bottom right corner. I'm going to use the pick whip again, but this time just point it towards the layer in general, just so that we can access some extra functions there. This comp.layer and the tiger, I'm going to type in source rec at time. I'm going to put in 5 seconds again, since that seems to be a great point. And then putting in a dot after that and grabbing its height and dividing it by 2, since we only need to go from the middle point down to the bottom right. Now, one of the issues here is that our text changes size constantly. It changes its scale, and that is something that we have to compensate for. So what we need to do here is also add in a time sign, and we can use this little expression again to pick whip just one of the scale values. If we do both, we're returning an array, and that's not going to be ideal. But if we just point it towards one of them, we get to add in 139%, but that's too much. We only want the difference that was made from the original 100% scale to that scale change that we have initiated. What we need to do in here as well is add in a divide sign and dividing it by 100. That just isolates the scale change and applies it to this whole kind of formula so far. So now that we've done that, we've found the very bottom right corner of the text, no matter its scale change. Now we just need to add in a little bit of extra padding as well as just the text itself. So what I found is a nice little solution for that is adding in a plus sign and just pick whipping the layer itself. This adds in the text this layer. We can type in source rec at time. We can grab the source time at time 5 and adding in its height times 2. This just assures us that there's going to be enough space as well as just a little bit of extra buffer for our layer. And we can end this all with a square bracket, and once we click out, you'll see that our text has just minutely changed. But the best part is now that if we change our player's name to say something else, it's automatically going to push down our layer, but maintaining that scale originally there. So if we type in FY now, you see that it just keeps pushing it down and giving us the space that it needs. If we type in a different player's name, something a bit longer, it's always going to just keep up with the scaling changes of the player name. Let's take it back to original Tiger. Is this convoluted? Yes, of course it is. But it means that we don't have to do anything once we change the player's name. There's no extra position references that we need to do. It's always going to be consistent. It's always going to be the same gap. And it's something that is set up and we can just forget about it from here on out. Let me just see the keyframes that we've got currently set up here. And I just want to delay these keyframes so that the player name can come on in, and then we just have a little moment before all these extra details also ripple in. And since it's already all set up with a nice little expression with that, the opacity and the text animators, it already looks pretty nice in the process. Now at the start of this animation, we have this text that says Melbourne, and I was thinking that would be really good for it to reflect the player that we're about to see instead of just the place that it was going to be played at. We can link these up so that we only have to change one and the other one follows suit. We can open up the Melbourne text, get access to its source text, as well as hunting down that layer that we have here with the player name, opening that up to say the source text. And it'll be easy enough to just pick whip the source text of the initial Melbourne text and pointing that towards the player name. And that automatically will now always reflect whatever the player's name is. But again, it would be great to be able to scale this up so that it would fill the space according to how many letters it has. So thankfully, we can just take the scale property, the expression that we have already made here, and not have to deal with it all over again, and copy that to our clipboard. Going to the Melbourne text here, adding in an expression and just pasting it in. Since we're already taking the value, it's already going to take into account all these different movements that it's got going on, all this animation, and it's automatically going to scale up to fit the boundaries. We get to then change the max width and the max height. The max width I am changing to about 1800 since it's a 1920 by 1080p comp, and the max height to be around about 900. And for this, I'm going to get rid of this extra kind of text to scale things up and down since we're already going to be filling the entire page. One of the things that we can't forget about though is that if we change this name to something that has 2 lines, such as Tiger Tiger, it's a pretty cool name, this one automatically recenters itself, but I don't believe that would be the case for this one currently. If we go back and just check on it, absolutely not. Right now its leading is completely messed up, so I'm just going to adjust this to say, just match that of the text so far, and it's not quite right, so I'm going to bring it down a little smidge just to tighten it up. But you also see that is no longer doing that centering thing that we had before. So we better copy that across. If I bring up the anchor point of our player name, we can just copy that text. Going over to the Melbourne text here, bringing up the anchor point of that too. and add an expression to that. And we can just paste that in. There is only one thing that we need to change, because right now it is doing the middle right section of this layer, and we want it to be the center. So all that we need to do to change it is change its width from just being the full width to divided by 2. And that's just going to recenter it. And once again, it's still filling out the page to its maximum height in this case. But I can always come back and change this to something else, like BZM again. We can go back to the start and see that fill out the page exactly as we need it to. It's just so nice to be able to set things once and for them to ripple out across the entire comp. Scaling, position, the anchoring points, it's just wonderful. The last bit of control that I really wanted to automate here is the color scheme, because the idea between these different teams, these different players, the different featured heroes, is that I may want to be able to quickly change the color scheme of this without having to hand select a shadow color and a highlight color. And the idea behind this was that I could specify one color and have a little slider that would have a bit of hue variance for a bit of creative control, and it would drive the entire CC toner effect. So I'm going to go to the CC toner layer that we have here and add in a color control. It's another one of these expression tools that allows us to sync things up later on. I'm going to then add in a slider control too. I'm going to call this one hue variance, but we'll get to that one in time. I'm going to bring these up in our little timeline now. And the easiest part here is that for the midtones, I want that to perfectly reflect the color that we have chosen in our color control. So that's easy as pie, just taking that pick whip from the midtones and pointing that towards the color control. From here, we're able to go in and just change this to our heart's content. We get to control just how vibrant something is, as well as how dull it is. Let's just leave that one there for now. It's a little bit more involved for the highlights and shadows, but that's something that we can work through together. I'm going to first enable expressions for the shadow layer. I'm going to declare a variable called C and hit the equal sign after that. And this is just going to be the color control. But before we do that, I wanted to mention that there are two different ways, essentially, that you can work with color inside of expressions. There's the RGB method, and there's also the HSL method. And the RGB method is just what is typically expected from the expressions, but it's much harder to control. It's harder to get access to, say, the hue, the saturation, or the luminance. So to be able to easily control the hue, saturation, and lightness, we first have to wrap this color control up with a function called RGB to HSL. And then we can just get to pinpoint our color control inside of that bracket, which means it's going to convert this color control to something that's much more easy for us to manage. On this line in the expression, this is when we're going to manipulate the color that we have currently chosen, make it darker, change its hue a little bit, maybe change its saturation, and then pass it back to the shadows property. But for that to work, it needs to be in the RGB format again. So before we do anything else, we have to type in HSL to RGB. So we first have to open up a square bracket to be able to stipulate each of these values. In the HSL, for instance, is going to be the hue. And right now, we're going to be pretty happy with that being the same as the original color control. So I'm just going to hit C and then access the first value of that, which is going to be in its own square brackets followed by 0. After that square bracket that we have just made, I'm going to add in a comma, and the second value here is going to be the saturation. And let's just copy that from the original color control too for now. Adding in that square bracket and accessing the second value of the HSL, which is going to be the saturation. Skipping ahead to the end of that square bracket and adding in a comma. And this last one is going to be the lightness, and this is something that we can now manipulate. We can stray from the original color control here and specify our own lightness. Now, all these values here, the hue and the saturation and the lightness, are just on a scale of 0 to 1. So if we put in the value of 0.1, for instance, that's going to be quite dark, but not quite black. There is in fact one more value when it comes to these functions. Not that it really matters to us at all at the moment, and that is just the alpha channel. We're going to be just specifying this as 1 for the entire time because we don't want to have to deal with any kind of transparency. So in the end, we have a hue, saturation, and lightness to RGB that's just going to copy the hue and the saturation, but then change its lightness and keep the alpha at 1. So if we click off that now, it's automatically going to change to the exact same hue, but just a little bit darker. If we change this to a pink now, you'll see that it also changes to a very dark kind of purple. We can copy and paste this expression that we have written now, go up to the highlights and paste that in. Instead here, we're going to change the 0.1 to about 0.85 instead, which is going to be very bright, but again, not perfectly bright. You can see now that we've now changed the 3 colors here based upon this color control. If we change it to say an orange, they're all going to follow suit quite nicely and continue that kind of color scheme throughout the entire thing. But at the moment, it's also incredibly bland when it's just the one hue. There's no kind of variance to the entire design. It would work well for some teams, but overall it's just a little one-dimensional. This is where the idea of a hue variance can come in. So we can kind of push the shadows and the highlights in opposite directions and introduce some more colors to our color palette automatically based upon the slider's value. To introduce this slider to our expressions here, we just have to dive into the expression, and after the C and in square brackets the 0, we can add in a plus sign. We can then pick whip the slider itself and add that in. And what I'm also going to do is divide this by 100. It just means that we can move the slider from 0 to 100 rather than between 0 and 1, just a bit easier to control. Now this works for the meantime, and if we just change the value of this slider, you can see that we're starting to change the hue of the highlights. But one of the issues is that you can quickly encounter that it stops working after a point. And that's because it's reached that threshold between 0 and 1. Once we've added in so much of the hue variance, it's just going to be always capping off at 1 or capping off at 0. And this is where we need the idea of it being able to wrap around and come back to the original value. So if something is 1.2, it comes back, wraps around to 0 and goes to 0.2 instead. Diving back into the expression, we can just go before the letter C here and introduce a math expression. That's going to be typing in the capital M math followed by ABS. And ABS in this case is grabbing a number's absolute value. So if something is -5, for instance, it just returns the number 5, takes away the negative sign essentially. And we can type in a open bracket here. It's going to automatically give us a closed bracket, which we're usually very grateful for, but not in this case. So I'm going to back up out of that and go to just after the number 100 and add in our end bracket. So yeah, that's just going to make sure that we're never going to be returning a negative number. We also want to catch any instances where the number exceeds 1. So if something goes to 1.2, we want that just to wrap around and come back to 0.2. And we can use the modulo operator here, which is a percentage sign. We can just follow that by with the number 1. And what that does is just going to divide the number by 1 and then give you back the number that it remains. In that case, if you divide 1.2 by 1, you're going to get 1 with a remainder of 0.2, and therefore it's going to wrap it around quite nicely. If we click out of that, you'll see that our color now changes, and we can go from anywhere from 0 to 100 and always have a different hue available to us, with 100 being exactly wrapped around and back to default. But what's also really handy here is that you can also go into the negatives and get a different kind of, it's just the same colors but going the other way. What we can also do now is copy this expression, paste that over the shadows one, just making sure that we change the lightness value back down to what it was, but then also reverse the effects of this hue slider. If we change that to a negative value instead, it means that we're going to be constantly going in opposite directions. The bigger this hue variance slider is going to be, the more different the shadows are going to be to the highlights. If we have something like 10, for instance, you'll see that the shadows are starting to go towards this blue hue, while the highlights are going towards more of a red hue. And we can keep pushing this further and further. You can start to generate these beautiful color palettes, which you would probably never really normally select, but it's all being controlled by these two little properties. Selecting a new color is very easy, and then just playing around with the hue variance till you find a kind of color palette that you seem to like, just like that. And because we've already linked this to the player photo too, and to a more subtle degree, it's very much stays in sync. It keeps us with a very nice, clean and consistent approach to the whole thing without being too dramatic. It's super easy and almost kind of fun to a degree, finding out what different kind of color schemes you can come up with just with these two controllers. So I'm stoked with how this all looks, and with all the different properties that we've introduced, we've set ourselves up with great success when it comes to adding things to the essential graphics. So let's run through the list of things that we may want to be able to control in a child comp. First off is going to be the color property that we have here. We can add that property to essential graphics. Color control seems great to me. I'm going to bring this over to the left-hand side just so we can see both of these at once, and we can start to add things as we go along. Hue variance slider also sounds great to be able to add in and control from outside of this comp. The player photo too would also be great to be able to exchange in for different player photos. And it's as easy as just dragging this layer off into the essential graphics panel here, and it automatically can be populated. We just rename that to something handy, nice and easy to control. Working our way down, it would also be good to be able to change the text for these player profile kind of details. We can type that in as well. Player details, just renaming that. Heading down to the fractal noise, it would also be very handy to be able to control the random seed, just so in case that we get any kind of odd layouts that don't work well with someone's name or something like that, we'll be able to add that in and change that as we need. Working our way down further, we also would want to be able to change the player's name. Source text for that, drag that in. I may even just drag that above a little bit and go player name. We also have our little hero here that is a feature hero associated with the player in particular. I'm going to drag that in and go featured hero. And I also want to be able to drag in its point control, which manipulates the position of this particular hero, and add that to essential graphics. Hero position, offset. Adding in the scale as well won't hurt, just in case we get a hero that comes along and it doesn't quite look the way we want it to. Hero scale. Last but not least is the team logo. We can chuck that in at the bottom and just type in that as well. So with that all said and done, I'm just going to close this panel since we don't need to see it anymore. And we're going to make a new comp from the composition that we have just been working in. Right-clicking new comp from selection. Everything is tidied up, everything's looking nice. And if we open up the essential properties of this particular layer, we now have access to everything that we would need. Just going to take this down to the very end. And now I'm going to incorporate a different player. He's called Yatoro, he's from Team Spirit, and it'll be easy enough to implement. If I just drag in the photo of him over the top, there he is, nice and easy. I'm going to change the player name by enabling some keyframes there, typing in Yatoro. Automatically resizes and fits in very nicely. I'm going to bring in the team logo as well, the Team Spirit team logo, and just drop that in. Very good. The featured hero, I'm going to pick the hero called Terrorblade, drop that over the top. Very easy to implement. Maybe just bring the scale down that little bit. It's going to, and then offset the position potentially. Nothing but crazy. Something like that. Going to go into the player details, enable keyframes for that. Copy across their name. And fill in those last details and hit OK and see how that all fits. It's a little bit long there, so we may be able to resize it because, of course, one of the important aspects is being able to test your templates to make sure things all fit for the different kind of situations. It could be a situation where we could change the scale of the player details name as well, just in case things get a bit too long. But if we just bring this down to, say, 28 pixels, we can bring this back in, still a little bit much, 24. Very good. Random seed we can change up so we don't get too sick of the same one. That looks pretty decent. We can pick a different color scheme for them as well. Since Team Spirit is mostly this kind of blue color, I think we're already pretty close to it. Something that looks like that, and maybe we'll play around with the hue variants, go into the positives to see what kind of color schemes we can come up with here. That looks pretty decent, maybe a bit more saturation. A bit brighter. Yeah, that's looking decent. And there we have it. A template that is super flexible when it comes to its colors, very dynamic when it comes to responding to the text that is involved, its position, the scale, and it's just flexible when it comes to how easy it is to control now that it's all set up. You can imagine if you were given 24 different players that you had to make little profiles for, just how much time this would save you when it comes to making revisions or changes. I think it's a fantastic system, and I'm super proud of all the little different cogs in the machine that have come together to make this thing work. While I'm sure you may not need to create this exact example, I'm sure there was something along the way that you'll be able to implement into your own projects that will save you a bunch of time in the processes, or just at least enlighten you about the power when it comes to essential graphics and expressions. If you've made it to the end of part 3 and you also were there for parts 1 and 2, thank you so much for joining me on this ridiculous journey. It's been a blast to put these videos together and fine-tune the techniques and all of that to make these videos a reality. And I hope that someone out there will be able to use these techniques, the expressions, the effects stacks and all of that, and be able to enhance their own projects. But yeah, thank you so very much, and I'll see you in the next one.